Welcome to the Half Stacks with Paul and Steph.
Your go-to podcast for tech jabber.
On today's episode,
Imposter syndrome. I've been hearing this a lot lately, not from people in our daily life, but just from like the internet. The theory is imposter syndrome is primarily when you try to measure yourself against someone else. Because usually the people we measure ourselves up against are usually people we think are better than ourselves, right?
but I mean, it's coming from a specific place though, because you've just joined a new team or you're in a new setting, and so you're with people who are more familiar with what you're.
Right. You know, it can seem never ending if you find someone that you admire and you're constantly measuring yourself up against, it's a never ending race because like you might be growing in your skills, but they are also growing in their skills. You'll always say to yourself, well, I'll never be as good as them, right? But that's not true. It's just that you're on your own timeline. Like you're capable of being as good as someone in your own time, but you can't fast track it. You know, you can't gain 10 years of experience within a year.
What you're talking about, because to me, like, I think the most common usage of imposter syndrome, where you feel out of place and like behind, but it's tends to be like a short time. It's not like an extended. Whereas if you're constantly comparing yourself to someone else, that feels more like, is coming from a place of self-respect or a self-esteem kind of issue rather than necessarily imposter.
Like obviously if you're starting something new, like I did recently, you can't expect yourself to operate at the same speed or capacity as you did when you were super familiar with things. Like I think that growing pain is always there, no matter how experienced you are. I think you're more likely to feel out of place if you're not challenging yourself regularly, you know, because I recently joined something new. I felt very stressed out of place, but that's because I spent several years doing something day after day, and the challenge level was very low, right? So, you know, I don't think that's imposter syndrome as much as you have to have reasonable expectations for yourself when you're doing something different.
Yeah, completely. Like if I look at the course of my career, like when I first joined tech, and I felt very much out of place. Like I just came out from basically web boot camp and managed to get hired somehow. And I was like, they knew that I, didn't have that much experience, so there was some amount of comfort level in being able to ask stupid questions and knowing that they weren't going to, look badly on me. But at the same time, like you're still working with professional people who have been in this industry for a while, and it's like, what the hell am I doing here? Like, it's kind of one of those cases of, it's very much, am I up to this? And then as you kind of get comfortable and you learn more, that's feeling kind of subsides. But no matter if it's, joining a new team or kind of like doing something where, I primarily work in UI, but every now and then go into the back end. And so going into the back end, I always feel like, again, what am I doing here? Like, this doesn't feel like the most natural place to be. So I think the imposter syndrome kind of shows up in, different settings.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I spent a lot of years working in the UI. I never quite felt like I was meant to be a UI person, but somehow I did it professionally for a very long time. I think there can be moments where you know you are good enough to do something, even if everything says you're not meant to. For example, I one time had to sort a JavaScript array. And it's as simple as can be. It was a JavaScript array full of objects that contained a date, and all I had to do was sort it. And I did that. And that PR got 10 comments about how to sort a JavaScript array. Am I bad at JavaScript? No, in scenarios like that where you're just getting a lot of comments,
Yeah.
it can have, multiple effects on someone.
But
Usually for me, people comment and I just like, okay, sure, like I'll either talk about it or I'll just fix it. Like it doesn't really get to me. But for other people, they might take it more personally, like, oh man, I just got like 10 comments on how to sort an array in JavaScript. This is like JavaScript 101. Am I not meant to be here? Right? Like, am I
yeah,
not
but
good at this?
I think there's a mindset to how you need to approach something like that. Because, like, well, one of my mentors once said, that basically PR comments are like a gift. Like it's someone trying to show you something better or prevent you from making a mistake. It's a way of kind of improving you and, helping you out. And so if you kind of approach it from that mentality rather than I need to beat myself up because I'm the most horrible developer ever for getting these comments, it makes it a lot easier to swallow something like that. And so
Yeah.
like I think that's where the imposter syndrome like I could see where it's at play, but at the same time there's a way to kind of push back within yourself on that and say, you know, are these actual, comments that are going to make my code better? And approach it from that angle, it makes it a lot easier to swallow something like that.
My mother-in-law used to tell me it's when they stop talking and bothering you is when you should worry. So it's like when you get to a spot where no one wants to review your stuff and no one wants to comment and, you know, point out things wrong, like you should worry because then it's like, well, am I just that horrible to work with? Right? Like if you can't take any sort of criticism against your work without getting hurt, it's really hard to be your coworker, right? Then again,
Yeah,
I'm the perfect coworker, as you may know, so it's fine.
what you said actually kind of triggers something for me because like when or in a previous position I had a boss who basically, or not boss, but he was a tech lead who never would review your code. Like all he would do is he would essentially merge it, and then if he saw a problem he would fix it.
Yeah.
And doing that you're not helping anyone. And it was a case of, is this like, are you fixing this because you actually see a problem, or is this a readability fix? Like, what is going on that, you know, actually you're improving it? Why are you improving it? And a lot of the times it was just his own, nitpicking that was at play. But then, sometimes he would randomly send out emails with chunks of your code being like, what's wrong here? And like have to like front end developers from all across our department would be responding. And so having that, kind of pattern of how you would treat people was not the healthiest way to kind of deal with things. And so, yeah, again, like it really makes that's one of those cases where, I think that's less of a imposter syndrome and more of a, self-esteem killer.
All right. But I think that the way we treat others can also either mitigate imposter syndrome in them, right? Like when I review code earnestly, not, looks good to me style, but actually review the code. I try to not leave someone hanging with just like, oh, you shouldn't do this, you should do this, and say it in some vague terms, right? Like vague answers don't help anyone. And it's not helpful for future readers of that PR to come in and be like, what does she mean by this?
Yeah, or okay, or I, what you kind of said is kind of fighting words for me. So here we go. So, I mean, realistically, I get what you're saying, but I also think there's a certain level if you give someone too much, then you're just coding for them.
I think that is a reflection upon the person that, you give them an inch and they take a mile, right?
No,
Because
or I agree, but or it's a reflection on them in that you or but it's really a reflection of how you see them. Like it's you implying that they're not that good, so you have to give them more information. Whereas, like, how I kind of approach it and how I think about it is more of there's a little bit of growth through struggle. Like, if
Sure. Yeah.
I give you, kind of a roadmap of what you need to look at, you kind of have to struggle through figuring out, okay, so this is the pattern that might work better here.
Sure. I
And
think
you might
it boils down
retain.
to what kind of relationship you have with the person. Like, you probably would not hesitate to show me how to JavaScript any day of the week, and you would not worry about me having taken a mile when you're just trying to like give me a little bit of help, right? But if it
Yeah,
was
but
someone new that you didn't know, you would probably be like a little bit more
y-
reserved about
yeah, but there's a
too
big
much.
difference there is I don't or I know that you're dipping a toe into my domain. You're not entering my domain.
Oh, I'm not welcome into
Well, no,
JavaScript.
no, 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 no. I've told you you should come back to LavaScript a lot. You've never taken me up on the offer. So don't
Hey,
say that.
I
Just
write a fair amount of JavaScript in my spare time. Okay, there's nothing wrong with JavaScript.
that's a first.
No, there is nothing wrong with JavaScript. It just shouldn't be used in areas where it was not meant to be used.
Oh, okay, yeah, I could. But
Um,
I mean,
but when you're
realistically,
working on
though,
the web, you really have no choice. You have
yeah,
to use
no,
JavaScript.
absolutely.
But going back to like imposter syndrome, I think JavaScript is a good example of like you should not try to be someone you're not. JavaScript is a browser based language,
Mhm.
and you should not try to use it on a server.
Okay, so I mean, I'm sorry, but there is this thing called a node. I mean, there is GraphQL. There are things where, JavaScript does power things. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be used.
Yeah, I was joking.
So don't get me wrong. I think you should choose the language that is best for your application.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
and
shouldn't be a case of you eliminate JavaScript just because it may not be the first thing you think of for backend.
yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if someone just wants to start programming, right, you shouldn't worry about imposter syndrome or being bad at something. You should just do the thing that makes you want to do more of it, right? So if that's programming all in JavaScript or using React or like ignoring ES6, at least you're learning how to program, right? Like you can you can get to that place, like ES6 in your own time, right? I just think that, you know, right now there's a lot of people that are like they have too much ego in their development, right? Like, oh, if you don't know how to I don't know. If I go back to like 2015 or 2014, 2013, I heard about JavaScript promises like way more than I should have. And it was always from people that seemed like they had some sort of ego involved. Like they had to show, I know more than you,
Oh yeah.
right? And it's not even people I work with. It's just like in general, there were a lot of those people back then.
Yeah, but I think that a lot of times developers use certain concepts to mask not knowing something.
Right. And, in regards to not knowing something, I think it's fine to not know, especially when you're new to something, right? It's like recently I was told by a manager, you should ask those dumb questions early because in a year from now, people will see it differently, right? When you're a year or two into your job and you're still asking, newbie questions, like that is seen really differently than being the new person
Yeah.
asking dumb questions.
And
But
especially like if you've gotten to that 1 or 2 year in and you're still asking those questions, it's very
right,
frustrating for your coworkers because it's like, well, what have you been doing?
right. But even then, it's like I've been doing this for 20 years. I don't know. It shows my age. I'm old. Um, Sometimes it is still hard to accept that as a person with so much experience, I have to still ask those dumb questions, right?
Yeah, I can see that, but I don't, or there's a difference between asking dumb questions and not learning from it.
That's
Like it's one thing to sit there and ask it and it just goes in one ear and out the other, or you don't try to understand the concepts behind it, in which case, no one really wants to deal with that. But if your intent is I really don't understand this and I just really need help here and to get this concept down, there's no problem with that. No one's going to be like holding that against you. I would rather someone come to me and be like, I don't understand this and get that help in that moment rather than, you know, struggle for, numerous hours and then all of a sudden they're like so frustrated that they can't take in the information anymore.
yeah, I agree. A personal rule I always hold for myself is to only ask a dumb question once. So it's like when I was finally learning ES6, I would ask you, so what does this syntax actually mean? And I would try really hard to remember it, right? So that I don't have to ask that same dumb question again.
Yeah. Again, I think there's a difference there because like when I know that someone doesn't normally work in this area, it's a lot easier to be like, oh, this is what that means. If it's a case of, you're a UI developer, you've been doing this for a couple of years, and you've asked me the same question like 20 times,
Yeah.
after the first or second time, if you haven't gotten it, I hate to tell you something's wrong here. And don't get me wrong. It could be how I'm explaining it. It could be that, this person learns in a way that is not a way that I teach, and therefore it's more on me. But it's also, they need to figure out what way of learning works for them and communicate that to their coach and be like, hey, this is what works for me. Can you kind of do this? So that way I can really get it.
Yeah, I agree. I think at the end of the day, imposter syndrome is very personal and how you how it affects you. Like I typically don't think about imposter syndrome too much. As you would know, I'm pretty stubborn and I like to some extent, I like the struggle, right? I like figuring things out. I like doing it on my own. Like that's just how I am. And, I also don't want to confuse imposter syndrome with just being frustrated with something. Like you can be frustrated and, stressed out and feel like you'll never get it, but that is not the same as, you know, inherently thinking you're not good enough for the job.
Yeah, but I tend to think that they kind of go hand in hand. The frustration is more of a symptom of the imposter syndrome. Like the imposter syndrome is a root cause because, you know, you're afraid of looking stupid to someone. So therefore you don't ask that question. Like, and so,
But
you,
is it always that? Like I would say that I tend to not ask questions a lot, but a lot of the times when I'm trying to figure something out, it's like I just think I can figure it out. So in a way, I think I'm too good to ask questions,
yeah,
not afraid to ask the question. Like, oh, if
or I
I
think
just spend
there's,
another X amount of time on this, I will figure it out. I don't need to ask.
yeah, I completely think there's an opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to imposter syndrome, where like you kind of get too big of a head where you're like, oh, I know, I've been doing this so long, I know I can figure this out. And again, like, just as much as when it comes to imposter syndrome being like, I'm not going to get this, and having a strict time box there of, I put this amount of time in to figure it out and I didn't get it. I think there on the opposite end, you also have to have that time box of, you know, I tried my hardest. I should have probably know how to do this, but at the same time, I came to the limit and there's no productivity coming out of this. So I
Yeah.
either have to scrap this idea or find someone's, to talk about this and work out a different solution.
Yeah, I have been learning that lesson really hard of not not trying to do it my way for too long, right? Like it's really hard. I don't know if all experienced engineers, developers face this, but it's really hard for me to stop trying to
Yeah,
figure something out. Like,
I think it's the nature of it.
right. It's like when you're really good at debugging and like noticing patterns and you're really familiar with the language, it's like, no, I'll figure this out. I've written so much code, I've done so many things, like I'll figure this out. Why would I want to, why should I stop doing that? Right. It's like, okay, I'll give myself 30 minutes to figure this out. If not, I will ask a question to someone who knows more or has more context. But what if it only took me 31 minutes to figure it out? I mean, I know that's unreasonable and silly, but that's often how I get. It's like I just need another minute. I just need another 5 minutes.
Yeah, but the
Yeah,
problem is as you just said, it turns from 1 minute to 5 minutes to
to
an
five
hour to
days, to
2 days, and then
5 months.
all of a sudden, oh my God, what have I done? Like I'm in the same spot and I've wasted a lot of time on
Yeah.
this.
But I also think yeah, it's really hard. Like even as an experienced engineer that has done this for a long time, sometimes it's really hard to swallow your pride and just be like, all right, I'm new to this and I just need to accept being new and that it might just be my first day for a little bit more
Yeah,
and I'll get back to where I was, right?
yeah,
And I think that's hard to swallow in a professional setting because, when I do projects on my spare time, it's like I can pick stuff up really fast. I can move a lot faster, but maybe the corporate overhead of, complex systems, all these things that your product relies on, or just every company's way of doing it their way, right? Like there's
yeah.
always some sort of version of a JavaScript framework in a company where it's slightly flavored for that company and that's that, right? So it's like when you spend a lot of your personal time programming and moving fast and you can pick up new languages really fast, it's really hard to swallow the pill that you might be a little slower at work.
Yeah, but I think you're talking about two different concepts
How so?
because learning a language is different than learning a domain.
Yes and no.
But if you're learning a language, we all know that like when it comes to programming, there's, similar concepts that run through every
Sure.
language. And so it's very easy to kind of take it, be like, okay, I've learned this. I can apply this concept here, here, here. But when you're moving from one domain to another, you have to learn the rules of that domain. Like it's
That's
not a
true.
case of you could just be like, oh, the concepts I learned here, I could just easily apply here. Maybe, maybe not. And so all of a sudden, like those things that you think, okay, I'm going to be able to pick this up fast, don't really apply because it's a completely different area.
I would agree with that. It's like concepts are concepts, and unless it's a completely new concept, which doesn't really exist much anymore. You
That
should be able to translate something like pattern recognition, right? It's like you notice a pattern going on, and you're like, okay,
yeah,
I
but
kind of get
or to me, what I or how I'm kind of seeing this is that those two ends of the spectrum are feeding each other because you've kind of be or when you were in one domain, oh, I know how to do this. Someone approaches you with a problem. Here's 5 ways I can handle it. And so, you're very comfortable in that area. And then all of a sudden, you go to a new area and you're like, I've been doing this for so long, I'm really comfortable. Whatever area you throw at me, I'm going to be fine. And then all of a sudden, it's a case of, wait, no, there's things I'm missing. I don't quite understand these things. What's going on? And all of a sudden, it's kind of worse because you have the mentality of, I shouldn't have to ask this question. I've been here for so long. I know what I should be doing. And so it kind of makes that imposter syndrome go from like maybe it would have been like a 10 to like 100 because you're like, it's not I'm new to this industry. It's not that I'm comfortable going to other people who may know more. It's I should have known this. And so it's
right.
actually harder to escape that box.
Yeah. I guess a large part of the imposter syndrome is having reasonable expectations for yourself. It's like if you're new, you can't expect to be an expert. And even if you're experienced, being experienced doesn't make you an expert, right? So it's like if you have 20 years of experience and you're going into something new, you have to be okay with being that new person for a little bit. And in a way, I think that's a good thing, right? Because I think a lot of experienced programmers that don't regularly change what they're doing and working with new people and like, just challenging themselves on the regular, I think they can get a little bit too high in their confidence to where they think, oh, I know all these things. I'm a great programmer. And sometimes you need that new thing to be like, to kind of humble yourself and be like, oh, this is what it's like to be new. This is what it's like to be the new guy with everyone talking to me like I should already know this stuff, right? And it reminds you, this is how I should change my communication to new people so that, I don't make them feel the way I felt when I was new.
I also think that there's a certain amount of hidden costs when you go to that because like when you're kind of in this place of, oh, I've dealt with a lot of things for so long, I know all these things, and then you start a new position or you're on a new team and you're kind of back to square one. There's things where you may recognize, hey, this doesn't look right, or I shouldn't be doing this. But then it's, I'm the new person, and therefore, obviously most of the people here are probably smarter about this than I am, and maybe I'm missing something. When really, like, you're kind of discounting your own idea. And
Right.
so you kind of have to, rely on others to be like, maybe, yeah, it may make you feel stupid to ask that question, but it may actually be a really good idea that you're having, and you're just not recognizing it as that.
I usually give myself a little bit of time before I try to do any major changes that I want to do,
Mhm.
right? Because like there is also nothing worse than a new person joining the team. They're like, oh, we should do this and we should do this and let's go use TypeScript everywhere and then let's change the whole stack to just be JavaScript. Like you have to have some amount of time to understand why are things the way they are before you can propose large changes. And I'm not saying you have to like wait a year. I'm just saying, if you want to change something, ask the questions to understand first. Like why is it this way? Right? Those
Yeah, but I think again, it has to be, you need to ask that question
yeah.
because or there's a tendency to, at least for me, like when I joined my last team, like there was this huge CSS file or SAS file. I looked at that, I'm like, this does not look right, but maybe I'm missing something. Like, to me, it should have been modularized. So basically, like, it should have been broken up and like done in a modern way. Instead, I was like, okay, I'll just continue this pattern. When it's like, no, you actually knew what you're doing. I recognized the problem and I should have made it better. Asking that question is important.
I think at the core of it, understanding the situation before changing it is key, right? And it's really hard to avoid. Like, we can say things like have reasonable expectations
Mhm.
or ask questions, right? And I can take that and know it and have it in my head and be like, I'm going to have reasonable expectations for myself, right? When I'm doing something new. And I will still be the same stubborn person I was yesterday, right? But I will try, right? Because, I mean, it's just hard to adjust your own expectations because it's hard to go from I am an expert in my domain and I have spent so long being the expert in my domain that I think I'm that good.
You have to kind of know yourself and how you kind of approach problems because it like I could tell you, hey, these are the things that I would do, but just because they work for me doesn't mean it's going to work for you. I think you have to kind of be aware of like what your strengths and weaknesses are and how you approach problems to kind of be like, hey, this is kind of some of the things in my toolbox that I get to use to break out of that imposter syndrome or being too big for my britches.
To avoid feeling inadequate. And this is a lesson from my recent changes. I have to make those big changes a lot more to where I'm doing something different, at least like professionally, like at least once every 1 to 2 years, right?
Yeah,
Like every 1 to 2 years, you get a sense of like really getting familiar with that domain before you can even build up too much ego and pride and cockiness and stubbornness. You make that exchange and you're like, oh, yeah, I've been here before. I need to understand this. I think challenging yourself regularly, not just in learning a new programming language, because honestly, I have learned a lot of languages and it gets easier every time.
you have to kind of find your expertise somewhere first.
Sure.
So, whatever language you need to kind of really attack it and understand it.
Yeah,
And
I
then you
agree.
also have to understand the concepts behind software development.
Right.
And between those two is how you kind of really get good at your job to kind of be able to start applying those to different either languages or domains.
If you don't want to feel inadequate, you just have to learn the things necessary.
I think we kind of covered the gambit of how it kind of shows up and kind of how you can maybe deal with it.
Yeah.
But I
Reasonable
don't always think it's going to
expectations.
be something that everyone kind of has to deal with at some level.
Yeah. I think the hardest part for me to with like the concept of imposter syndrome is having reasonable expectations.
Yeah,
Because if anything, I tend to set my own the expectations for myself really high. And it's really hard to lower them.
yeah. But eventually, as you get more comfortable in a position,
Yeah.
those expectations return to where they should be.
Yeah. All right. I think that's it. I don't
See you
know.
next time.
Yeah.